I found all three presentations fascinating, but I'd like just to refer to the Vedas survey, where the question is simplistic, not just simplistic, but stupidly simplistic. And you have to remember that it was addressed, or the readership is Lithuanian. These are ethnic Lithuanians who are responding to a survey. And quite obviously, for an ethnic Lithuanian, the Soviet regime was worse than the Nazi regime. I mean, that's an obvious statement, is it not? Yeah. So we shouldn't be surprised by that particular response. The third response, that both are equally evil, that's when somebody actually starts thinking, I should now say that, of course, both regimes are evil. But for a Lithuanian, no one should be surprised about that. And again, as regards Professor Sudedelis, he said about introducing his own family history shamelessly. I don't know whether you're all probably familiar with the work of Neil Ferguson, in particular his book Empire, How Britain, I think, Made the Modern World. Fantastic title, isn't it? Yes. How Britain Made the Modern World. Well, in that book, Neil Ferguson introduces his own family, Scottish. There's even a photograph of his family in the book. So Professor Sudedelis has nothing to be ashamed about. Dr. Sudedelis, he used the term school students. I think that's slightly misleading. It should be either pupils or school children, because students make it sound as if they were more mature than they really were. It doesn't make that incident any worse, of course, but there is a difference there linguistically.
In America, 5-year-olds are called students.
Sorry?
In America, 5-year-olds are called
No,
students.
we're here.
No, I know. We
I agree, the question is rather silly the way it's worded, but that's the way people talk. You know, when they speak to you about these kind of things, which is worse and so on, and it's, of course it's not surprising. Even more in Estonia, for example, where you can statistically prove that for an ethnic Estonian, the Soviet occupation was many times worse, so statistically.
I think, I'm sorry to intervene as chair, but the problem with public opinion surveys of this sort, of which there are huge numbers all over Eastern Europe, is that the questions which are asked invite simple-minded answers. And the Institute, Sociological Institute, University of Warsaw, Professor Krzemiński, has been trying to investigate anti-Semitism in Poland and Ukraine, and they came to the conclusion that you couldn't investigate it using these simple questions, and that rather you should have in-depth interviews along with these questions, which framed them in a different way. So I think that I agree with you, we shouldn't be too worried by this statement. Indeed, I also found it rather encouraging rather than the reverse. But if you ask somebody, yes or no, is Hitler a bad thing, then it isn't really a satisfactory answer, but I'm sorry to intervene.
My name is David Farley. There are, of course, many interpretations or theses or views about the past in history, and our views change. Could I try your reaction to a latest one that I've just come across? I just read the latest issue of the New York Review, which has come out on Sunday. So this is coincidental with this conference. There's a large piece in it by Timothy Snyder on the Holocaust, drawn on several books. Two new books, two in particular. One is a French book called Heydrich and the Final Solution, the Solution Finale. The other one is on German occupation policies in Lithuania, 1941 to 1944, by somebody you've already mentioned, that is to say, Christoph Diekmann. And based on these books, Snyder comes up with a proposition. Well, there are many propositions, but perhaps I'll try it on you. Up to June 1941, there hadn't been, apparently, a major plan for the mass extermination, the collective elimination of the Jews. The final solution, the Holocaust, began in Lithuania. Why? Snyder points out that between June and November 1941, over 150,000 Lithuanian Jews were massacred, over half the Jewish population of Lithuania. Why is that? And he comes up with the following proposition, and I wonder what your reaction is. He believed that there was a double destruction of Lithuanian social, administrative and legal structures. There had been these structures in the interwar period. The Russian arrival back in Lithuania from 1939 to 1941 saw the destruction of the Lithuanian elites the destruction of the political, legal and administrative structures then obtaining. The Germans then arrived and they destroyed the structures put in place by the Soviet Union. So Snyder's proposition is there was an absence, a vacuum of administration and of formal structures of organisation within Lithuania. And the main driving force behind these actions, Heydrich, seized that opportunity to do certain things because the vacuum gave him free rein, based on which it spread to other areas. That's Snyder's interpretation. The Holocaust began in Lithuania. Why? Because the conditions were conducive because of this double destruction. What's your view about that?
I did read that review before I came. I think the way it's described here, the vacuum, is a little bit maybe too general. Yes, there was a vacuum, but not entirely. Now, the Holocaust in Lithuania is the two phases of the Holocaust, the one which is in the summer and fall of '41, not just in Lithuania, but the shooting actions.
Yes.
And then after the Wannsee conference, the decision to bring the victims to killing centers in Poland. These are two very different phases of the same idea and plan, but very, very different in implementation. There was, yes, a vacuum, but most Jews did not die in that vacuum. I should add that an important thing I co-authored with Christoph Diekmann, our study. And, you know, in early August of '41, 7 to almost 8 weeks after the war, over 90% of Lithuanian Jews were still alive. That is, they had not been killed in these pogroms. They were still alive. The decision to kill, and operation which starts in mid-August and then, like a wave, destroys essentially provincial Jewry and drives all the rest into big city ghettos, essentially. It's the end of the Jewish community in Lithuania, essentially, by November '41, in any reasonable description of that term. This is something that is quite highly organized. Most Jews did not die at the hands of their neighbors, in the literal sense. That is, someone they knew or whatever. Many did, but most did not. Most died in well-organized police and military-style operations, well-planned in advance, using administrative structures of both German and Lithuanian. So I don't know that the vacuum, yes, it is true that the Soviets removed a restraining force. But I think worse than that Snyder does not mention, is the fact that when the Soviets came in June of 1940, it legitimized a radical narrative, which was this: Smetona ran away, he's a friend of the Jews, they were soft, they didn't resist, they didn't fire back, we're ashamed of them, so therefore, the right-wingers are right. You know, we have to fight. And a part of this, the right-wing activists, the most extreme nationalists who participated, were foot soldiers of the Holocaust, actually, came from this tradition, which had been anti-Smetona interwar. And they said, you know, you made a mistake, and so we should go with Germany. Smetona was not a pro-German politician. And so this narrative during the Soviet period, you know, what's striking is the very first week of the Soviet occupation, there are rumors about the war coming. And a lot of Lithuanians are looking forward to the war. Well, who else is going to drive the Russians out? I mean, this whole flower-throwing thing is nonsense. I mean, my father used to say if Martians had invaded in June '41, people would throw flowers at them. I mean, the cry, the war is coming, is a joyful thing for many Lithuanians in June '41 because it happens 5 days after the deportations. And many Holocaust survivors even say the country was like on a barrel of gunpowder before an explosion. And so then this rips out in these sort of pogroms and harsh actions. But again, I want to stress, most Lithuanian Jews did not die as a result of that. They were killed because the decision was made by early August '41 to begin the cleaning out of the provinces. And see, communal violence can be spontaneous, but genocide requires political decisions, organization, and a massive apparatus. And even in Rwanda, which many people envision as some sort of, you know, people running around with machetes, not so. There was a political decision beforehand to do this. It was organized beforehand, and then the implementation. I mean, that's my answer. I don't know if I answered your question, but I don't think the vacuum thing is, I think it's too general.
a contemporary production of memory and history as well, that it's not just a neutral, necessarily a neutral exercise. So my question is, given the experiential gap that you've referred to between Western and Lithuanian narratives and how to bridge those gaps, which is clearly what this conference is about and the broader project. You also mentioned that there are 1 million documents which need to be researched and they're all in Lithuanian, and that research clearly needs to happen in Lithuania with Lithuanian scholars. So my question is, I'm going to quote something you said at the last conference in February last year. You said, when you talk about history and memory, politics is always there in one form or another. So clearly there can be, without going into details, people are more familiar with this than me, but clearly there can be political imperatives around the production of history. So the question is, given the discussions about double genocide, about possible political imperatives going into the EU next year, what advice would you have as a professional historian, cognizant of the difference between academic production and popular memory, for staying away from the politics, given that this conference is, for example, funded by government, that people can...
It's not funded by governments. It's funded by my research money and by research money from Brandeis University and by the Rothschild Foundation.
So there's no Lithuanian Foreign Ministry involvement in the conference?
No.
Okay, thanks for that clarification. So the question is, does one ever take money from the government to produce history? It's not an offensive question. Given the relationship between memory and politics, how do you produce dispassionate, impartial, comprehensive history and stay far away from the political agendas? It's a question I could ask in South Africa, and I do ask in South Africa.
It's a series of articles, and there's one by an Estonian author, Eva Clarita Petai, P-E-T-T-A-I, which she discusses the historical commissions and the relationship between Western historians and Baltic historians when these commissions met, and how they sort of had problems communicating. And she criticizes both the Western professionals and her mainly Latvian, Estonian, Baltic historians. She thinks Baltic historians are too provincial, they're too narrowed in on their own victimization, and some Western historians tend to be a little bit arrogant and somewhat out of touch. And so it's a good study of this. I think that there is a role for government. I mean, in a sense of tolerant education and publication of textbooks. So I'm not against the government funding research, as long as the professionals who do the research agree that it'll be, well, you can't use the word objective. I mean, at least it follows accepted academic practice of critical evaluation of primary, secondary sources, as well as some sort of peer review. And once these conditions are met, I'm not sure that commission government finance research necessarily is a bad thing. But I would say that the encouraging fact is that some young Lithuanian scholars have learned Yiddish and Hebrew, and that's essential for them. If they can do that, plus use the materials we have in Lithuania, then of course you're going to produce work that is much deeper and in-depth. I gave the example of the demographic profile of perpetrators. To do that, a young researcher has to go to the special archive and look at all these interrogations of the Soviets after the war, do other resources, other materials, and come up with, say, okay, what kinds of people participated? And they found some valuable information. One of the conclusions, preliminary, is that they weren't very different from the general population. We're not talking about, obviously, sadists or psychopaths mainly. These are normal people, rural people, with a somewhat larger element of prosperous farmers, actually, among them. And so that's the kind of research I'm talking about. I think that would be very helpful. And it would take away this myth that this was just a handful of riffraff who did this thing. And take away the myths of Germans dressed in Lithuanian uniforms and all this other stuff that, I think decreasing numbers of people, I'm glad to say, are taking that stuff seriously, although these myths still exist. I don't know if I answered your question, but...
Questions to all the speakers. I may have missed it, but I don't think I've heard the word the church today, the Catholic Church. It was mentioned yesterday about the setting up of cooperatives for the Lithuanian agricultural labourers. Was there a role? What was the role of the church, both in the war period and during the Second World War as an institution and both as individual priests? Did they have a role in combating it, in putting it down, in beating it up? Nobody's mentioned the church.
I'm not sure that you are quite right, because I was talking about clerical trend, and I was talking about some priests who were more anti-Semitic than other Lithuanian intellectuals. To summarize the whole picture of 19th century, I may reiterate that the most anti-Semitic groups were those coming from clericals, including Catholic priests. But at the same time, for example, they are not agitating to use force to organize pogroms, etc. There are many cases known when priests try to stop pogromщики and not allowed to be Jews, etc. And there were also the cases when priests were beaten by their Catholic peasants because priests tried to save Jews, I mean, from beating and troubling. So it's not a very simple picture as we have it in the 19th century.
I might only a few words. I agree with Darius because the situation in the war in Lithuania was almost the same. It's difficult to talk about the church as an institution and its attitude. I think has more sense to go deeper to various cases and to look how various persons acted. So the answer will be very complicated. Hierarchies didn't show any signs of anti-Semitism in the interwar Lithuania. But the press, as Darius mentioned, the Catholic press, a lot of articles, in mainstream press, but the relations of the hierarchies were different. So,
a very good question, actually, a very important one. I dealt with this in the article that Franz Marguerite edited in the book. I have about 4 or 5 pages on the church situation in terms of June 41 and particularly that summer and fall of 41. It's a complicated story. I mean, if you take the Metropolitan of the Church, Archbishop Skvireckas, who was an aging old person, he, in his diary, says Hitler is a very right-thinking person. This same Archbishop, when he hears about what's going on in Kaunas, sends his Monsignor to try to stop it into the city. He doesn't want Jews getting beaten up, but his diary is full of these anti-Semitic kind of stereotypes. One of the bishops, Justinas Staugaitis in Telšiai, actually issued a pastoral letter dated 10 July 41, which he clearly warns people against any stealing of property of other groups, meaning Jews, and killing of them, not to take revenge. So there were several public. That's the only. Well, no, that's the only real public document that really says straight out. It was a pastoral letter to the diocese, and it's pretty specific about what the bishop wants done. He's warning people against killing those who are outsiders, that is, non-Lithuanians. It's very interesting is the discussion that took place in September 41 when this former Prime Minister Brazaitis, the one who was interred, arrives at the Archbishop's office and says, we have to do something because Lithuanians are getting a bad reputation. And we should all maybe make a public statement condemning the killing of Jews. And the Archbishop says, no, I can't do that. I already spoke privately to some people, and he wiggles out of it, you know, claiming that he can't interfere in politics, although actually when it came to condemning Soviet communist stuff, he was all over the place. But the very interesting thing, which is a morally interesting issue, was the issue of property. And there's a discussion by the Kaunas diocese priests in 1942, what do you do with Jewish property? And there's a very interesting discussion between two factions. One of them says, you can't touch that. That's blood property, we can't touch that. And the other group says, look, the Jews are gone, and there are poor Lithuanians who are starving, you know, let's use, you know, some of this property in that sense. It's a conundrum. On an unofficial level, I think Bishop Brizgis is also a good example. I mean, he was pro-German in his politics, but he also had contacts with the Jews, as is evident in Avram Tori's memoir of Colonel's Diary. He goes to see Brizgis and they talk, and he knows about rescue efforts. And I would take you out of the Lithuanian context to get you even more complicated if you want your head to be even more confused by conflicting, counterintuitive stuff. Is Timothy Snyder, whom we talked about, has published a blog on the New York Review of Books page about Metropolitan Sheptitsky of Lviv. Here is a man who supported the German war effort and also saved Jews. I think only in the West could such things be counterintuitive. They seem counterintuitive, but in the context of what is happening on the ground in these countries, that's not. And that's part of the point I was trying to make, is that the experience of the people and that so-called bloodlines, I mean, is you can't compare it to other parts of the of German-occupied Europe. It's just different.
When will people connect the dots? When will people produce biographies of people being involved in, for example, conservative or reactionary movements in these riflemen, who then are involved in mass killings, for example, have a post-war fate which may be difficult or less difficult, we don't know. Because this has been an very important contribution to understand Nazi German perpetrator motivations, biographies, trajectories. I mean, the study about Best by Herbert Ulrich, but also the collective studies, obviously, Christopher Browning and Michael Wild. These are studies which look at particular individuals or groups of people and follow them through a longer period of time to understand better the motivations, how they unfold, and how they are in many cases radicalized, in order to help us understand what went on.
I'm afraid to say that that's a situation which is very difficult, and not much has been done. In fact, some of the biographies of people like Bovelis, the Commandant of Kaunas, are hagiographies. Some of it's fairly disgraceful. There was one major Argus who lived in Australia. He's all over the documents in terms of participation in the right-wing sort of actions. And he arrives in Lithuania and publishes a book. I mean, I would like to see more of an appetite for doing what you describe. While I'm optimistic on some level in some areas that I mentioned, I'm very discouraged by the lack of that kind of willingness to undertake real biographical research about the perpetrators, Lithuanian perpetrators specifically, and that's a problem.
I'll add only a few words. One of our students in the Institute of History, he tries to write a collective biography of those who perpetrators who took part in the Holocaust. It's about, he had a biography of about 100 persons. So it will be probably the first research subject.
I would like to make some statements. One about Mr. Kinka's remark about that the Soviet occupation was much harder for Lithuanians. That's true, and I fully agree. But today, when we know already Project Ost and what we had to expect from Nazis, we could fight with this narrow understanding a little bit, and you can't fight with experience, but you can explain that it was a very temporary relaxation for Lithuanians, that if Hitler would win the war, we all would sit now, not maybe the British, but the Lithuanians would sit behind the Ural. My second little remark is about the voting you have shown. I perceive it very optimistic because both are equally, the Gulag and Holocaust is already a very important statement. It proves that Lithuanians understand already that the Holocaust was also very terrible and not better than the Gulag. So if you take into consideration, you can see a change in the perceiving of the history of the 20th century. And you asked about the church and its role. I will not go into it. I have something to say about it, but I would like to remind you what Pope John Paul wrote about Jews. I have never read something more beautiful than he has written. And I think the Catholic Church has all possibilities really and is changing in many ways its view. And for instance, in Lithuania, the biggest fighters, the strongest fighters against anti-Semitism are the Franciscans, the Bernardiner monks, and such Sasnauskas Julius, I would like it to be translated into English, wrote a wonderful rauda, how to say, lament of Panerai. Nobody has written such a wonderful piece of text, you know, and I could mention many others as well. But I would like to ask historians now a question to you. It is very important to study the story of anti-Semitism in Lithuania, and really it proves a lot. But can we not now start to write some history about Lithuanians fighting against anti-Semitism, or the story of fighting with anti-Semites? Because this would maybe be more convincing. We can compare Kudirka and Basanavičius. We have many people in the 20th, in the interwar period, and today we have really a lot of fighters in Lithuania, Lithuanian fighters against anti-Semitism. And I strongly believe, of course, the Jewish community plays a big role, like Faina said, in showing what happens and protesting. But I think that fight against anti-Semitism should come from inside, from Lithuanians themselves. Here is the difference. I remember I got once a letter from my late brother, from the Lithuanian family, to my next, how you can say it, my next closest,
the dearest foreigners.
To my closest foreigner, because he was Lithuanian, is the brother from my second family, and I was crying very much when I got this letter. But he explained to me what he meant. He said, "You will never be responsible for the Holocaust in Lithuania, but I am responsible as a Lithuanian." So this was he meant, not that I am alien to them. So I would like that in Lithuania it would be something positive, not only all the time accusations, but show that Lithuanians have from inside the power to fight. And a proof is also the last, I didn't read it, but also the interview of Parulskis, which made a big impression on me, you know. And we have really materials to write about that. So I would very much encourage to write about, is it possible? This is my question to you.
You know, when we write about anti-Semitism, we also write about who fought against it. But I mean, today there was not much time for it. But to mention one more publication in this relation, there was a book published 2 years ago, book in Lithuanian, a collection of articles about how Jews and Lithuanians get to know each other in the interwar period, edited by Jurgita Verbickienė. So this is a book about how translations into another language started. So how Lithuanians started to read Jewish authors and vice versa. How Jews started to learn Lithuanian language in school, etc. So there is such publications already.
My name is Lionel Koplowitz. I'm
past president of the Board of Deputies of British Jews. Just two questions I'd like to address to the third speaker, that's the professor from Pennsylvania. And the first question, which is this: following the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of August 1939, when the Baltic states were regarded as part of the Soviet Union's sphere of influence, in October, after the war, Poland was over, Lithuania received back from the USSR Vilna, so that it was able to enlarge its boundaries, have its own national capital back. But part of the deal was that Soviet troops could be in the country. Now, if that was the case, and it then had effective control, what was the need for the Soviet Union to go and occupy Lithuania fully in June 1940? And the second question is this: between June 40 and June 41, what was really the attitude of the Soviet Union to the Jewish citizens? Because in Lithuania, because I had family who had a geschäft in Daugsos Gatve in Kovno, and they had more than 20 employees they were regarded as bourgeois, and they lost their business, but they didn't suffer any physical persecution. Now, was that the usual pattern, or what was the pattern?
That's a very excellent question. I mean, see, on the Ribbentrop, the Treaty of Mutual Assistance and the Transfer of Vilnius, signed on October 10th, 1939 between the Soviet and Republic of Lithuania, actually did leave considerable, the Soviets did not interfere much in internal affairs of the country until June 1940 or spring of 1940. So yes, there were military bases in Lithuania, but and Lithuania actually was a de facto protectorate of the USSR. But the internal political system remained the way it was. Now, why June 1940? One school of thought is, of course, the defeat of France, and the German entry into Paris coincides exactly with the occupation of Lithuania. Christopher Diekman doesn't think that's unimportant. But remember that the Soviet Union was hoping for a long, drawn-out war in the West. They were shocked to find the Germans took a very quick victory in the West. This was not in their plans, because they were, after all, I wouldn't call them allies, but they were at least tactical partners of Germany during that period. They supplied Germany with raw materials, they allowed German submarines to use their bases, and so on. But there was internal independence, and obviously that couldn't last. I'm not up to the latest scholarship, but it's clear that by the fall of '39 there were plans to move into the Baltic. I should add a historic kind of interesting trivia thing. The Soviets expected resistance, because we know from their documents that they had hospital beds ready for wounded and camps for POWs, so they were not sure that the Lithuanian army would just allow them in. And I don't know if I answered the question, but the June 40 occupation was essential for them. I think strategically it was a huge mistake, because if they had left that area alone, the Germans would never have swept so quickly through the Baltic. They would have preserved a kind of a warning zone, would probably have been strategically better for them from a military standpoint, at least in my view. 40-41, yes, the Jewish organizations were closed, properties were nationalized. On the other hand, as I point out in the article, for Jews, very obviously from a geopolitical perspective, the Soviet occupation was far preferable to the other alternative, even if they suffered suppression. And there is a document in the NKVD files about, there were anti-Soviet Jewish organizations active in the underground, some of them during this period, and they were followed by the secret police, the Soviet police, and so on. Now, the really tragedy was that from the Gentile population's point of view, that didn't matter. You know, just as when you talk to Jewish people, often the fact that several thousand Lithuanians were shot by the Germans also doesn't change the narrative, you know, unfortunately. But no, they were suppressed. The whole question of Communist Party membership has now been thoroughly researched. We know exactly what the ethnic percentages were within the Lithuanian Communist Party, how the power was controlled and all that, and this is research that was essential, even though we realized that some of the research can be manipulated to try to prove this. Well, the title of my paper, and Pauline says it exactly. The public perception, unfortunately. So you're right. I mean, your family situation is not at all untypical. I mean, most Jews lost their property, private property, in 1940-41.
My question is, the last professor said that you gave the two captions of the VE Day in the UK and what was happening in Lithuania, and you said all hell broke loose. And I'd like to ask a question. Poland is often criticised for continued anti-Semitism because of Kielce in '46 and some of the murders of returning Holocaust to the victims. Could you expand upon whether this happened in Lithuania?
There is no Kielce, but there are instances of some people who sheltered Jews and rescued them were attacked in the post-war period, yes. Some of the anti-Soviet guerrillas, a smaller number of them came from former German formations or police battalions, and certainly they had some anti-Semitic tendencies and committed violence. And so that part of it did exist, and there was an expression by the Soviet guerrillas in their memoirs, anti-Soviet guerrillas, sorry, in their memoirs. When they killed someone, they would say, "We sent him to Abraham." You know, this was their sort of slang expression of killing communist officials, for example, in the resistance. It's a very violent period between 1945 and about the worst, till about 49 was the worst period. I think by comparing scale, it would be something like El Salvador in the 80s, a small country with tens of thousands of civilians killed, not counting combatants, and roughly well over 120,000 deportations to the Far East. But there are individual instances of killing of Jews after the post-war truth. But we haven't found anything like the Kielce thing that's on that scale. There's also, remember, there's a whole problem between Poles and Lithuanians in the Vilnius region. It's not anywhere near the scale of what happened in Galicia and East Ukraine. West Ukraine, excuse me. But we're talking about hundreds of people killed between 42, 44, even after the war, 45, in this Polish-Lithuanian conflict. It didn't affect the people on the cemetery, this part of the Polish inscription. That was not part of that particular conflict.
My name is Tessa Rejak. I'm a professional historian of a different period, and I've got very short questions. Actually, the first was simply, if I might, add to the response to the question about bourgeois, so-called Jews in 1940. There were, bourgeois Jews were included also. It wasn't just suppression of Jewish institutions, as you know, in the deportations of June 41 to gulags, as were Zionists of various non-left-wing kinds. It should just be mentioned, shouldn't be forgotten. But one observation as a professional historian, it was interesting to hear that thought that the archival work, of which so much remains to be done, can and ought to be done by Lithuanian researchers, and only by then. It seems a pity. I don't know whether this is because it's sort of their duty, or whether it's a technical matter, but I rather wonder if Lithuanian researchers, and one takes one's hat off to them, have learned Hebrew and Yiddish. There ought to be an equivalent thrust in this country. I wonder whether, and indeed in the States, can one study Lithuanian in any universities? And I think that obviously these are the materials, these are the tools. Excellent. Well, in that case, there ought to be researchers here working in this rich archival material. Just an observation. But I wanted simply also, and finally, to reflect a little bit on the Vedas survey, where perhaps we are missing the point in finding bit simplistic and one can be too hoity-toity as a historian, but it seems to be enormously important and not a bad question to ask in terms of gauging of public opinion for one reason, and that is that in relation to the double genocide problem which rumbles on and on, if we're ever to resolve it, I think those who bitterly oppose such a formulation, what they are looking for, as it were, on the Jewish side, is precisely a recognition of the uniqueness, if you like, of the Holocaust. And of course it's simplistic to weigh up evils, you know, the death of one person is equivalent to the death of however many millions, and suffering is suffering, and statistics can be turned in different ways. But nonetheless, what the Jews endured at whosever hands during those years is obviously unparalleled, and that is the kind of recognition or the kind of coming together that would still be necessary. And so it is extremely interesting to see the VEDAS survey results, and maybe they are optimistic in one sense. It would have looked worse 5 or 10 years ago, but it does show that there is still work to be done in coming together, it seems to me. So I'd like to know what your thoughts are on that.
Just very briefly, when I say Lithuanian researchers, I mean people who can utilize the language and the method. And we have, it's always, just make this one point. When you read works by Western historians, for example, Joachim Tauber, and people who don't have the skills to do the archival research, it's amazing the difference in the quality of the work. That's all I meant. I don't mean that ethnic Lithuanians should take over the research, but that aspect of it is obvious when you see the difference in the work done by people who can do it and people who aren't able to. So that's, I hope that answers your question. Thank you.
I'll just make one comment to this. There are a number of Polish historians here too, and I wonder, perhaps later we can talk about this. As somebody who's worked in the Polish archives both through the interwar period and the Second World War, I feel tremendously envious of the Lithuanian archives, which seem to me, for various reasons which are mostly historical, they seem to be much larger, much fuller than the archives we have in Warsaw and elsewhere, but this is perhaps something we can talk about later.
Vic Seid from Sociology Department in Goldsmiths. I've been really thinking about and taking in a lot of historical understanding, and I've taken to heart the notion of lived experience and the recognition of that the suffering in Lithuania shouldn't and can't be minimized. At the same time, I've taken on, because of the history of Soviet historiography and the experience, it's very difficult to come back to understand the framing in terms of what happened in terms of the Jewish Holocaust in Lithuania, and that's going to be a process that's going to take time, and it has taken time. But I was very struck by your questioning, and you're saying historians, that they've questioned the notion of the double genocide and the way that that's been used, and that most historians who are working in the archives have questioned that kind of formulation. And you say, and you draw on your own family history, and I was touched by that, and you also say something about the experience in Lithuania of how to then come to terms with these different histories of suffering. And that you pointed out to the difficulty or the resistance of doing long-term history in relationship to the perpetrators, but also the importance of the archive. So what do you think, knowing something about the archive, how should we begin to think in quite different terms about the relationship, if we're not going to think in terms of different genocide, about the Russian and the German experience, or the Nazi and the Soviet experience? So if we don't want to go down that road, and we see certain dangers for Europe in going down that road, how should we, or how, from the experience of the archives that you've developed, should we begin to think about that formulation in a way that gives the integrity to what was the Holocaust?
I don't see the Soviet and Holocaust thing as a zero-sum game. That is, that if we acknowledge one, we must somehow diminish the other. It all depends, it's all in one, for the people of the region, this is one broad experience. And in that sense, I suppose the Holocaust to some extent inevitably must be contextualized within that 40 to 53 period. By that I don't mean that its uniqueness should be diminished, but it does occur in a context. What happened before and what happened after affects the whole history. And so you can't just pull it out and take 41, 44 and just... So it's a difficult issue. What I would think is that I would think that the best thing to do are more detailed studies using younger archival researchers. Now there is an older cohort, and I certainly don't mean my young colleagues, who have published some things that are still double genocide stuff. But I think their influence has diminished somewhat in the last few years. That's true. So they exist, and some of them work in academia. But I don't think that's becoming the main narrative right now. But I just think that we should get away from the zero-sum game. And Timothy Snyder said something very interesting when he was in Indus in May. He said, look, the two systems are compared. That's an academic subject. You compare totalitarian systems. If you say they cannot be compared, you've already made a comparison in your mind. So, you know, it's not a matter of equating. And then again, see, you've injected, unfortunately, and made it difficult for me because, in essence, there's a moral question here, you see? And I don't see any ethical difference between mass murder and genocide. Crimes against humanity and genocide, what can possibly be the difference between one form of mass murder and the other form of mass murder? On the other hand, you have to use terminology precisely. And you shouldn't call a museum Mr. Genocide Museum because it's misleading. See? But so it raises a lot of difficult questions, you know. I mean, so I guess I should thank you for that, giving me a problem. I have no easy answer, in other words.